Thank you. I always appreciate this opportunity to get in front of some folks and talk about some of the things that we do. I did bring some handouts along today, so if you'd like to pick up something, there's a PowerPoint presentation, which is what's on the screen here. It's a fairly short one. There's a resource guide, and there's also, very creatively, we call this the blue background loan chart. So you're welcome to pick up any of those things today. We'll be talking briefly about some of them and a little more in depth about some of the other pieces. I've been with the SBA for a lot of years, not always in Cedar Rapids, not always doing what I'm doing now. I've done a number of things over the years, but it is a federal government agency that exists to help the small business community. Whether you're a startup, whether you're buying a business that's been out there for a while, whether you're in business already and you're either struggling or you're wanting to expand, basically those are the situations in which we get involved in assisting the small business community. And we can do this in a variety of ways. So we're going to go briefly through some of those ways, and then we'll get a little more into the financing, which is the whole reason why you're here today, talking about some other financing sources, SBA loans, but there are other sources as well. One of the things that I like to start out with, and there's one sheet that I'm going to pass around here. This is just a very small sample of some of the success stories that SBA has. And what I mean by success stories is these are organizations that used our programs. It may have been loan programs, it may have been SCORE counseling, it may have been some of the other resources we have that in their infancy, either when they were just starting out or as they were going along in the early years, use some one of our resources. The only one really that's on this particular list that's from Iowa is Winnebago Industries. You know, the campers out there that have been around for, it seems like forever and ever and ever. That one I know a little more about than some of the other stories, not only because it's from Iowa, but because they have done a lot, they have used our programs a lot. They've had 4 loans over the years, particularly in the early years in the 60s and the 70s. When they bought the business, because basically it was a trailer business initially, not an RV type trailer business, but like a flatbed trailer kind of business. And then they decided to expand. They got a loan to help them with that. They got another loan to expand along the way. They got another loan after they had a major fire. There was a major fire that destroyed their plant, their manufacturing plant. I don't remember the timing exactly on it, but I think it was the late 60s. And insurance didn't cover everything, which a lot of times happens. And so when insurance didn't cover the total loss, then they came to SBA and got a guaranteed loan to help them do what they wanted to do in terms of rebuilding and expanding a little bit. So that's one of the ones that, that I can tell you a little more about. What I'm going to hand around includes some of these on the list, but it also includes some other Iowa success stories. Casey's General Stores, that's an Iowa success story. Heart of America Inns and Restaurants out of the Quad Cities. Mike Wayland, Thunder Bay Grill, the Iowa Machine Shed, a lot of the hotel and motel properties that they have. West Music, which is located in the Coralville, Iowa City area. They're another success story of ours. And in fact, what we were talking about initially about SCORE, which is a volunteer organization we sponsor, Pearl West, who started West Music originally back in the 40s. I knew Pearl after he retired and his sons started taking over the business. He became a SCORE member in the Iowa City chapter and eventually became the chairman of the Iowa City chapter, and I worked with him very closely for a number of years. So there are a number of success stories right here in Iowa that you may recognize in addition to the big boys. And yes, we did help Nike and Apple and Staples and all the ones listed on this list, plus a lot more. When we talk about SBA in general, just to give you that brief overview, these are basically the programs we have available, and the 3 C's on the top there are what we talk about the most. The capital, the counseling, the contracting options. Capital is what we're going to talk mostly about here today, but counseling certainly from the local SCORE chapter, the counseling and training. Today is a good example of a training opportunity that they provide for you. Typically, the counseling is at no cost, and the training can either be free or low cost, depending on the situation. And then contracting, you guys may have some opportunities here in this area that a lot of other folks don't have if you're interested in expanding your markets. And one of the ways you want to consider doing that is by doing some contracting with the federal government. And the federal government's what I'm going to talk about mostly here for just a moment, but there are state government contracting possibilities as well. With the Rock Island Arsenal, not that far away. I'm working with them a little. They have a big procurement conference coming up the end of May. It's going to be at the iWireless Center, and I happen to be one of the people on the steering committee. Contracting is not my forte necessarily, but right now, because we don't have a contracting expert on staff in Cedar Rapids, I'm kind of filling in the short term. Small businesses can get government contracts, and it can help you expand your markets, and there is assistance available through this process. The process can be cumbersome sometimes, not only from a paperwork standpoint, but just understanding the procedures and the processes that are in place. But originally, when our agency was established in the 1950s, it was established because of contracting opportunities in the Eisenhower administration. And then later on, some of these other things came about, including the guaranteed loans that we'll talk about more shortly. Predominantly, the loans that we make are guaranteed loans through local lenders. We don't want to be in competition with the local lending community, but we do try to help them make loans that they otherwise might not make. Sometimes because of a higher risk industry, sometimes because a business is a startup, it's considered higher risk automatically, and so sometimes they may be a little hesitant to make a loan to you as a business owner, but with our guarantee, we help from a collateral, I shouldn't say really collateral standpoint, more from a security standpoint. And so primarily what we do are government guaranteed loans. I will use the terminology 7A and 504 a little bit when we start talking about some of the programs on this particular chart. And when our new director in Des Moines put this PowerPoint together last year, no grants, no grants, no grants. People are always asking about, typically that's one of the first questions that we get, that SCORE gets, the other resources get. Where's the grant money? There's got to be grant money out there. Well, there still is a little bit of grant money out there, but typically speaking, there's very little now, certainly in comparison to 10 or 20 or even 30 years ago. So while there are grants that still exist, they are far and few between, and typically they're for very small sums of money, not for larger sums. They may be for $5,000, they may be for $10,000, and a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times when you're in business or wanting to get into business, you're going to need more money than what that can provide. So for all practical purposes, there are no grants. We'll talk about some of these loan programs of SBA's here shortly. Counseling, we've talked about a little bit already as it relates to the local SCORE chapter. SCORE is an organization that we sponsor nationwide. So if you're not going to stay here in this local area, you're going to go back home if home is someplace else, or you're just going to move and take your business somewhere else, chances are there's a SCORE chapter near you. There are chapters in every state. We have 8 here in Iowa. And that, of course, that's what I'm going to know more about rather than Illinois. If you happen to be on the other side of the river, I may not know some of these stats, but there are SCORE chapters all over the country. There's about 350 nationwide, roughly 11,000 volunteers within the SCORE organization. So counseling and training is primarily what they do. Mentoring, a big thing of what SCORE does. SCORE is excellent at that. They're excellent at a lot of different things, but staying with you not only in the beginning stages, but all the way along in developing and expanding and getting your business successful, they can be of assistance to you. The Small Business Development Centers are another resource that SBA sponsors and puts money into. We have an SBDC in the Quad Cities. There's only one in the Quad Cities now because the one on the Illinois side closed here at the end of January. I think that's probably a temporary thing, but at least for now, that's probably your closest SBDC. There is another SBDC in Iowa City. There's another one in Burlington. That is a network too nationwide, and typically there are more SBDC centers, both here in Iowa as well as nationwide in terms of numbers of centers than there are SCORE chapters. And the SBDCs do counseling and training as well, with the counseling being free and the training being low cost. We also have a women's business center here in Iowa. It's headquartered in the Des Moines area, and while they really haven't done a lot of outreach into the state in recent years, just in the last 6 months or so, they're starting to focus more on getting outside central Iowa. This is another program that's sponsored by SBA. We put actual, money into an organization. As you might imagine, they are focused on helping women business owners, but they won't turn anyone away. Counseling and training again. If you've been around very long at all, you probably know that the federal government has a lot of acronyms that they use. The next one, the VBOC, what we call the VBOC, the Veterans Business Outreach Center. This is something that is not just SBA funded, but we do work in cooperation with them, and the VBOC that handles this particular area is out of St. Louis. They do come to Iowa periodically. There are special veterans and military community workshops and seminars that are put on from time to time. The U.S. Export Assistance Center, the one that handles our area, is from the Twin Cities. And I talk with Carlos up there periodically. He's helped a number of businesses here in Iowa. If they're interested in getting into export, or if they're kind of in export already and they really don't know where to turn, they're getting these inquiries from overseas for their product or their service, and they really don't know what to do, well, we can certainly get you in contact with Carlos. Coming back to contracting again for a moment, there are different kinds of certifications that if you fit the qualifications for it, you can get what I call brownie points. And when I say brownie points, that's kind of an old-fashioned term, certainly, but it gives you a leg up over a business that doesn't have any of these special certifications. 8A has to do with socially and economically disadvantaged. HubZone has to do with certain census tracts in a community, or it can be a whole county. Women-owned, certainly, that's another certification, or service-disabled veterans. And then surety bonds are something else that are kind of related to contracting, but a little separate from it. We do get involved in helping businesses that are innovative. They're developing new products, new services, and if it is a product that can be fairly easily commercialized, it can be brought to the marketplace without a lot of difficulty. We do help with innovation, and actually this is the one situation in which there are some grants. If you're developing particularly a product that one of the federal agencies can use, whether it's NASA or whether it's Department of Defense or whether it's the National Institute of Health. Those would be some of the agencies. There's 12 or 13 agencies that work through this SBIR program, and you can get some help in developing prototypes and some of those types of things. I'm not an expert on that, believe me. But we do have a tour. This was just announced yesterday morning, as a matter of fact, for the SBAR program. It is coming to Iowa this summer. It's coming to Ames in August, and that's all the details I have on it yet. But what it does is, if you are innovative and you're interested in getting in front of some of these people from these federal agencies that want to do this type of contracting out, that would be a good opportunity for you to go to Ames while they're here, whatever those dates are going to be in August, and get in front of some of those people just to see whether it makes sense or not. We don't get that opportunity very often. It's not an annual thing here in Iowa. So it is something you can take advantage of. Disaster programs, this is the one situation where we do make direct loans. We don't work with local lending institutions when there's a presidential declaration of a disaster. Typically here in Iowa, it's going to be flooding or tornadoes, but it can be earthquakes, it can be hurricanes. I've even seen some smaller disaster declarations still by the president here in Iowa when we've had widespread blizzards that cause problems, and especially for the farming community, the ag community. If they suffered a lot of loss as a result of losing livestock because they couldn't get to the livestock to feed them and water them or whatever, that would be another situation where someone could get a direct disaster loan from the federal government, from SBA. We work with FEMA, as you might imagine. They're very much involved in disaster help from the federal side. And there can be business loans, there can be, physical disaster loans, there can be economic injury disaster loans with no physical damage that you may have sustained. And then that's another exception to the normal rule. In a disaster situation, we can make loans for homes and for personal property. So we're going to kind of go ahead and move on into some of the financing pieces of information here, because I think that's the reason why you're here anyway. You may be interested in knowing that there are more than 28 million small businesses here in the country. For a number of years, that number was kind of static at 25 million. But in recent years, we've seen a steady increase. So roughly 28 million small businesses. And when we talk about small, most people would consider what we call our size standards or our size guidelines. Basically, it's what you'd call small and medium-sized businesses. It's not just the really small mom and pop kind of business. Certainly they're a part of that, but we aren't limited to that. They employ 55 million Americans. They create 64% of the net new jobs annually. And a couple of these stats I found very interesting. I knew that a lot of businesses here in the country were home-based. I didn't realize the percentage was as high as it is. 52% of the businesses in this country are home-based. And then another interesting stat, only 2% are franchises. That just blew me away too. I mean, that was way lower than what I expected. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what goes on in the business community around the country. This particular handout, the Small Business Resource Guide, basically every state has something similar to this. This is going to have Iowa information in it, names, addresses, phone numbers, websites that you can use as resources as you're developing your business, as you're developing your business plan, as you're going along and expanding. There's a lot of good information. We update this annually. There is an online version to it. Sometimes it's a little difficult to find, and if you're having difficulty finding the online version, be sure and let us know. All of our contact information is toward the front in here, if I can find it. Page 10. For both offices in Iowa, for Des Moines and for Cedar Rapids, all the staff are listed here. Again, names, addresses, phone numbers, emails, that kind of thing. When you're talking right inside the front cover here, These are the SCORE chapters in the state of Iowa, where they're located, when they have office hours, basically that kind of contact information. So not only are they listed here in this ad inside the front cover, but there's also a counseling section in the guide, and they're listed in terms of what counties they cover in the middle here. One thing that I like to mention in this guide that can be very deceiving, and it's toward the back here, if I remember which page it's on. There's a 2-page list of SBA participating lenders. This can be confusing because this is the list of lenders who made SBA loans in Iowa, businesses in Iowa, in the previous fiscal year. So in this particular case, with this edition, these were lenders that made loans in Iowa in our fiscal year 2014. This by no means is an exhaustive list of the lenders that can work with us and do work with us on a regular basis. So if the lending institution that you have a relationship with already is not listed here, that doesn't mean that they can't or don't do SBA loans. There are only a very small handful of banks in the state of Iowa who do not work with us. Now, not all of them work with us on an annual basis, but I don't know how many charters there are in Iowa. I think it's roughly around 350, something like that, separate bank charters in Iowa. Obviously, there aren't 350 banks listed on this page and a half, but they are basically all signed up with us all across the state. Some interesting pieces of information. There are some misconceptions, if you will, out there about what SBA can and can't do. And so I like to go through this once in a while, particularly when we have a little bit of time, like we do today. When you're talking about bankruptcies, when you're talking about previous criminal record, when you're talking about non-citizens, sometimes the conception is out there that SBA can't make a guaranteed loan to people like that, and that's not necessarily true. Now, I'm not going to tell you in all cases, if you have a criminal record, that we're going to guarantee a loan for you. But it depends on the situation. If you've been through a bankruptcy, it depends on how long ago it was and how you've handled your finances in the meantime. When we're talking criminal record, it depends on what that criminal record is. Again, how long ago it took place, how many infractions there are, what type of infractions. Obviously, these type of people aren't going to be in this audience, but if somebody committed murder, no, we're not going to guarantee a loan. If you were involved in robbery or embezzlement, no, we're probably not going to make a guaranteed loan to you. But if sometimes what happens is when we're younger, we do kind of some stupid things, but they get a criminal record, for us. It's something that shows up. And if it's been a long time ago and maybe was only one thing and was a misdemeanor as opposed to a felony, yeah, you probably can get an SBA guaranteed loan. We automatically do a cursory FBI check on every applicant that comes across. So something's going to show up if there is something there. You need to tell us if there's been a record, if you've had some infractions in the past. There are some questions in some of the application forms that ask you those questions. Be truthful in how you answer them. But there are certainly possibilities that we can still guarantee loans. And when we're talking non-citizens, as long as the individual has a green card or legal permanent residency, we can consider loans to non-citizens. When we're talking about some of the types of business financing that's available, certainly bank and credit union financing, typically those are the first places we may go because that's what we're familiar with and what we're aware of. But there are some other sources, and we'll talk about 7A and 504, some of SBA's names here shortly. There's also the Iowa Microloan program, and typically this program is for those people in business that are looking for smaller sums of money, $50,000 and less, but may not have the greatest credit scores. They may not be eligible for the traditional bank loans or the normal SBA guaranteed loan, but there may have been reasons why you have a lower credit score. You know, maybe you lost a job, maybe you had a lot of medical bills and expenses, maybe you went through a nasty divorce and your credit was affected as a result of that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't credit worthy, but the Iowa Microloan Program is for higher risk situations, and as you might imagine, the interest rate is higher then also. I'm going to get an update actually later today, this evening, on what the current interest rate was on the Iowa Microloan Program, but I know more recently it's been 8 1/8, which typically is higher than what traditional lending would charge you. But if it helps you get a loan that you otherwise can't get, it is an SBA program. It is funded by SBA. The statewide office is located in Boone. They have a good website for the Iowa Microloan Program, and it is mentioned, not the Iowa Microloan Program, but microloans in general are listed on this chart. And it is another resource that's available to you so that you don't have to use credit cards and get 12, 15, 18, 21% interest. So while it's higher than some of the typical rates, it's certainly not as high as the credit card rates. The USDA has money available for businesses, interestingly enough. If you happen to be in a rural community and they have different definitions by population, they have different definitions on how they define rural depending on which program it is. But they have an FSA program, they have a business and industry program as well. And I happen to live in a county that is rural in nature, as well as the community I live in obviously is much smaller, so we meet most of those definitions. After we moved to this community, I was really surprised to see, because I didn't understand the programs at that point, that the USDA was making a loan to help establish a child care center in our local community, because we really didn't have a lot of child care available, not to meet the need that was there. And USDA came in and they helped finance some of that because we were in rural areas and there was a demonstrated need there. So there are a lot of things that the USDA can do through some of their programs. It's not all just ag related, although it tends to be in rural areas. Venture capital, you know, that's the big boys. When you're really expanding and expanding quickly and you have something that you're willing to sell and that could be sold business-wise in, say, a 5 or 6 year time frame, venture capitalists might be somebody that you want to get involved with. Papa John and the Papa John Center here in Iowa, he's a good example of not only a philanthropist, but somebody who's involved in venture capital and finances projects, not only here in Iowa, but across the country. Angels and angel investing, and maybe this is where mom and dad or uncle or aunt or grandma or grandpa come in, brother, sister. They're kind of informal angels, what I call informal angels. They're somebody who's willing to help you out from a financial standpoint, either gifting you some money or loaning some money to you, maybe at no interest. They want to be repaid, but they're not going to charge you any interest. There are a lot of angels out there, and there is a formalized angel network here in Iowa, as there is in a lot of states. They're hard to find. They don't promote themselves on purpose, but there are networks of angel investors out there. So if you happen to fit in what some of these folks are looking to invest in, I know there's a woman in my particular community I just found out about fairly recently. She's looking to invest in businesses in our particular county. She's wanting to focus on women-owned businesses because it's her own money that she's wanting to invest, but she would be considered an angel investor. She's made this known to the local Chamber of Commerce person, but she's not getting it out there widely. I don't know who all knows about this, but they are difficult to find, but they are there. And then there are a lot of local, city, county, and regional loan funds. Sometimes some of this money comes through the USDA, but sometimes it comes from other sources as well. So the point being is I'm trying to give you a little bit of a smattering, if you will, of thinking outside the box, that there are a lot of sources available that you can go to. Why would a lender want an SBA guarantee? Well, I'm just going to give you 3 or 4 ideas here. By no means are we involved in the lion's share of commercial lending that goes on in this country. I don't know what our percentage is, but it's very small of the commercial loans that go on and that are made routinely. Most of them, I'm sure it's probably in the 98% range that we're not involved in. I don't know the figure, but I'm sure that it's very high. And it's those situations where you have a reasonable chance of success, but maybe the bank is a little uncomfortable because you don't have a lot of collateral or the type of business you're getting into. And it's those situations that we're willing to step in and help out so that you can get the loan. So when there's a lack of or limited collateral, a good example might be in a service kind of business, because typically there's very little collateral there. And so we all like to have some collateral or some security to back up a loan when we make a loan. But when, because of the type of business or the situation, there isn't a lot, maybe that makes sense for the lender to get SBA involved. Another situation could be when you need a longer repayment term. If you need maybe 5 or 7 or 10 years to repay it, to ease your cash flow in your business, that might be another good reason for getting SBA involved. I already mentioned or kind of alluded to the risk that might be involved. When there's higher risk involved, particularly in a startup situation, those are automatically considered higher risk situations because you don't have a proven track record. Also, certain types of businesses or certain types of industries. Those of us that have been around lending for a while, and I was just checking some stats last week on this, not only here in Iowa, but nationally for SBA guaranteed loans, the category that we do the most lending in is accommodations and restaurants and bars. You know, those are high-risk industries. Convenience stores are even considered high-risk industries these days. They weren't always that way. Trucking companies, those are also high-risk industries. So if you happen to be going into that or you're in that already, maybe it makes sense for an SBA guarantee to get that just to give you a better chance of getting the loan and giving some extra security to the participating bank. Once in a while here in Iowa, and I work in an 18-county area, and I do have a few banks that are very small in nature. They don't have multiple locations. They're in small rural communities that have what are called lower legal lending limits. And each institution has a particular lending limit that they're not supposed to go over. And the point that I'm getting to is the portion that SBA guarantees doesn't go against their legal lending limit. So I had one bank that I was working with, and they had a customer, it was an ag customer that needed a fairly good sized loan, and their legal lending limit was $300,000. Well, their customer was needing close to $3 million. And so on the surface, what that would suggest is, well, this bank couldn't make that loan. But when they came to us, they got our guarantee. There was some exporting involved, so they got a little higher percentage of guarantee than typically is available. Actually, he was able to make that $3 million loan to his particular customer and then keep the customer because of the SBA guarantee. We don't see that a lot here in Iowa, but we do still see it. Credit scores. Are credit scores important? Yes, they are, absolutely. You need to take your financial obligations and handle them responsibly. And of course, that's reflected in credit scores. Some of the things that we look at too is child support. If you're more than 60 days delinquent on child support, we're not going to guarantee a loan to you. If you have fairly low credit scores, again, it depends on the reasons for it. If there are some of those reasons in play that I mentioned earlier, like having lost a job or, gone through a nasty divorce that financially devastated you, there are some exceptions to it. But we do look at credit scores. They are very important, and so you need to keep your credit as clean as possible. Student loans too. This is maybe a good audience to mention that in. If you're delinquent on your student loans, you're probably not going to get an SBA guaranteed loan, because we have another system that we automatically review in every single loan application situation. And if you happen to pop up on that system, it's called the CAVERS system, as having delinquent student loans, then automatically your application is basically going to be tossed out. You'll be told why, but potentially that's the reason. Do I need to actually put some cash in the business? Probably yes. If we're talking a startup situation or we're talking a change of ownership situation where you're purchasing an existing business, yes, you're going to have to come up with some cash to put into it. There are only a couple of exceptions to that, which we don't see very often because a lot of times they don't really qualify, but there are a couple of exceptions. We do expect from an SBA standpoint a minimum of 10% of whatever the total project cost is, including the working capital needs of the business. We expect you to come up with a minimum of 10% of the total amount needed. And we expect that in cash for you to put into the business. And then our guarantee can be on the remaining portion. Sometimes there's a little bit higher cash injection required, but 10% is the minimum. We can make loans to retail, service, manufacturing, construction, wholesale, farm operations, basically almost the whole gamut. Not totally. There are a few types of businesses that are ineligible. Certainly, even though gambling is legal in the state of Iowa, that is an ineligible type of business. So I know Cedar Rapids has been wanting to get a casino into the community for a long time. If they can get the approvals for that, they cannot come to SBA for help. That's one of the prohibited kinds of businesses. We can make loans up to $5 million. We can guarantee loans up to $5 million. So we can make some fairly good-sized loans to good-sized companies. A lot of times manufacturing companies may need some of those higher amounts than possibly a retail or a service type of business. But we can go up to the $5 million, and that's been true for quite a long time. So I've already suggested what we can loan money to do from a structure standpoint. We can finance startups, we can finance changes of ownership, we can finance expansions, or if a business just happens to be struggling and they need some, cash flow relief, they need some more working capital in their particular business, we can help struggling businesses as well, as long as it isn't so far gone that we can't resurrect it, if you will. Interest rates, those are negotiated within limits. You as a business owner negotiate that with the lender. We set the maximums allowed. Typically speaking, the maximum right now is 6.25. Again, there are some exceptions to that, but for the most part, the maximum right now on an SBA guaranteed loan, the maximum that could be charged is that 6.25. Right now, on smaller loans of $150,000 or less, there are no fees. Typically, there are 2 fees associated with SBA loans, and because of some legislation that was passed a couple of years ago, on loans of $150,000 or less, the 2 fees that are normally on those 7A loans are totally waived through the end of September. We don't know whether that will be extended into the new fiscal year or not. Last year it was, but we didn't find out until the last day. Actually, it was the first day of the new fiscal year when we found out it had been extended. So we won't know probably until the very last moment. But at least through September 30th on those smaller loans, there are no fees, which means you get to keep more of the money in your pocket, bottom line. If you happen to fit into the military community definition, and that includes guardsmen as well as reservists and then spouses of those particular categories, there is some fee elimination to a higher loan level if you happen to qualify for that military community definition. Just to give you an idea of how the money can be used, we've talked about some of those ways already. Certainly working capital that I've mentioned, purchase of inventory, purchase of machinery, equipment, furniture, fixtures, land and building construction, major renovations, and the one that's been around probably the least amount of time, but maybe 10 years, is refinancing of existing debt. If you have some existing business debt that could be lowered or lengthened, lowered the interest rate or lengthened the term to give you some relief on cash flow, we can refinance some of that business debt. And sometimes when it's the bank's own debt, we can refinance some of that debt as well sometimes. Term of the loan, typically a working capital or inventory loan can go 3 to 7 years. If we're purchasing some major machinery and equipment, we can go up to 10 years. And if we have land and building, again, building construction, major renovations involved, we can go up to 25 years on that. We have gone through a whole bunch of stuff in a very short period of time here. I don't know if you have any questions at this point, because I'd like to take some of your questions. Obviously, this is going to be of more benefit if your concerns are dealt with.